The proceeding will start shortly. 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 The proceeding will start shortly.
Good morning and welcome to this session of the Defence Select Committee's examination of UK military operations in Mosul and Raqqa in particular and in Iraq and Syria in general. We have two very involved and highly qualified witnesses to help us in our inquiry today, and I'd be grateful if each of you would introduce yourselves and say a little bit about the role that you've been fulfilling in respect of this inquiry. General Jones.
Good morning, Chairman. Good morning. Major General Rupert Jones. So I was from August 2016 until September 2017 the Coalition Deputy. So the official title was Deputy Commander, Strategy and Support of the Combined Joint Task Force, the Combined Joint Task Force charged with the military defeat of Daesh in Iraq and Syria. So I was the senior non-US member of the military coalition.
Thank
you. Chairman, Committee, good morning. Air Vice Marshal Jonny from October 2016 to October 2017. I was the UK Air Component Commander, responsible for all of our operations in the Middle East region, but most obviously for Operation Shader, so our operations over Iraq and Syria.
Well, we think it's a splendid opportunity really to get information from the horse's mouth, as it were. And the first to ask a question will be Gavin.
Thank you, Chair. And good morning, gentlemen. I wonder, could you outline just how we as a country contributed to the coalition's mission in Iraq and Syria?
Well, perhaps if I lead off and then hand over to Air Vice Marshal Stringer. So, I think I can say without contradiction that the UK was the second biggest contributor from a military perspective in the campaign. I say that from a coalition perspective rather than from a British perspective. One of the responsibilities I had was for the coalition line of operation, as it was called. And if you add up all the things that various nations were doing, not that it's in any way competition, but you've add all those things up, quite clear that the United Kingdom was the second biggest contributor. And so I'll leave Jonny to comment on what the air element of that was, but in the kind of land and the broader perspective, that involved some very senior leadership positions, my own deputy position, but other deputy positions at key headquarters around the coalition. On the ground in Iraq, about 600 troops involved in the what we call building partner capacity, training the Iraqi security forces, an absolutely fundamental part of the mission, which I'm sure we'll come back to. But critically, I think one of the reasons why the UK plays such an important role is its kind of leadership role. So other nations, I think, look to the UK, as is often the case, to follow our lead to some degree. And critically, the United Kingdom had a very powerful set of broader permissions. So it's not just about numbers of airstrikes, numbers of troops, it's about the permissions that we were able to operate within the mission.
Thanks, Rupert. So just looking from the air component perspective, I think three things mark out our contribution. The first of it was the breadth. So it was very much a balanced contribution, everything from strike and multi-role aircraft, Tornado and Typhoon, through drones, through all of our intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance aircraft, through to air transport and then air refuelers. The second was the quality of it. People would default to equipment, they always do. What I would stress at the outset is the quality of our people, not just those in flying roles and supporting them, but also in some key embedded coalition roles as well, whether it be in the air component headquarters in El Udeid or elsewhere. And the third thing I think which probably marks it out is the tempo at which we operated. So we're now coming up to 4 years support to Operation Shader. I would say that the Air Force, relative to its size, has not operated at this tempo or scale since 1945. So it's been a big commitment, and in the region that's taken a sort of standing figure of around 800 to 900 airmen and airwomen from the eastern Mediterranean down to the southern end of the Gulf, all in the Air Component Command.
We say the second largest contributor. Could you give us a percentage or a proportion as to how you do that when it comes to personnel and how closely aligns with the largest contributor, maybe third, fourth? I mean, are we talking, a large chunk, or are we really second fiddle in the...
I mean, I think we should be honest with ourselves and indeed grateful that the United States have taken the lion's share of the burden of this campaign, and we should be extremely, grateful that is the case. But if you take the non-US element just as a vignette, but it's kind of, as I say, it's not about numbers. It is, as Jonny has said, it really is about quality. But if you take, and I'm a little bit out of date, you'll recognise, but in September last year, there were about 4,300 non-United States service personnel in Iraq, of whom about 600 were British. But as Jonny says, it's really about quality, and as with the air component on the land side, arguably any number of nations could train the Iraqi security forces in infantry skills or whatever it might be. What I think the UK is able to bring is the quality of its personnel. We're clearly global leaders in some fields, such as counter-improvised explosive device work is an area where we're recognised as global leaders. But I'd also say in areas such as infantry training, which is on the face of it, any nation could do, but I think you will have come across British soldiers well enough to know that they do it to a very, very high standard. The British Army is very proud of having a very fine war-fighting reputation, and that gives them a very strong basis on which to help other militaries.
So, I mean, if we take the point that the contribution is greater than just the numbers alone, which is a fair point to make, it then feeds into the value of that overall contribution. Could you help the committee understand just how closely aligned the coalition strategy is with UK policy aims, and how we shape and what strength we have to shape as a country the overall aims of the coalition?
Yeah, I mean, I was in quite a privileged position. One of my roles was to be the military link into the global coalition. So I think I went to 10 global coalition meetings during the 13 months. So I saw quite a lot of that element. And I think what I would observe is the power of the coalition. This was arguably one of the most powerful coalitions I think we have ever seen. 74 members in the global coalition, 30 of those contributing to the military campaign in Iraq and Syria. And so devising a strategy for all of those nations is a complex process. What I would say is that the United Kingdom, because of its significant military contribution to the campaign, has a privileged position when it comes to contributing to the overall strategy. I often use the phrase, you've got to pay to play. If you want Washington, if you want the senior leadership of the global coalition to listen to your advice, be that from politicians or be that from the military, you've got to be doing the hard yards. The United Kingdom quite patently is doing the hard yards, and as a result of that, the UK voice, both at a political level and at a military level, is listened to very carefully.
Give an example then, perhaps, of how UK policy has shaped the coalition's mission and aims, and maybe how we have acquiesced for the collective will of the coalition and compromised on UK policy.
So let me answer that from a military perspective, and I'm not going to kind of make a broader political observation, but if I take, for example, the humanitarian and the stabilisation efforts in both Iraq and Syria, and I hope we might discuss a little bit about that later, because I think it's really, really important to what has happened. I think it is not unreasonable to say that British advice, British officers, fundamentally shaped how that approach was conducted. So recognising that you could not just, in the case of Mosul, liberate the city of Mosul without concern for the 1.75 million people who were in the city at the start of the battle. You cannot just fight a war in a bubble and ignore those people. You, the military, the Iraqi military, must play a fundamental part in that work. That was very heavily shaped by British advice into the coalition, both by, I would say, by background, by conscience, but also by position. The same could be said of the Syria humanitarian stabilisation effort, where, again, it was British officers who, from a military perspective, really drove the interagency conversation into the wider coalition to make sure that there was a joined-up plan for what followed the liberation of Raqqa.
Thank you.
Graham. Thank you, Chair. It's and good morning to you both. It's to Major General Jones. How are operations controlled through the coalition? How does the coalition control operations?
So I might invite Air Vice Marshal Stringer to follow up in a moment, because a really important part of that is clearly the control of the air element. But worth saying, of course, the air element was fighting in support of the wider Combined Joint Task Force commanded by General Townsend, my direct boss. So there's a day-to-day control element, and in terms of how we provided support to our partners that Jonny will talk to. But it's slightly multifaceted, because you've got layers of activity going on. So you've got the long-term work in terms of taking the Iraqi security forces and indeed our partners in Syria. But if we stick with Iraq for a moment, so an army that was all but defeated in late 2014, defending the gates of Baghdad, taking that military, allowing it to get its mojo back, transforming it, getting it back into the fight, such that it could liberate Iraqi towns and cities. That is clearly a long-term, deliberate activity, and so that really came to a crescendo with the Battle of Mosul. So that sort of activity is going at a slow tempo. In terms of how the overall campaign is controlled, I think the first thing to say is that, and you will recognise this, I hope, this was very much about our partners. So the campaign design comes from our partners. In the case of Iraq, from Prime Minister Abadi, the sovereign government, through his military chain of command. In Syria, subtly different, but we worked with the leadership of the Syrian Democratic Forces, and it would be really they who dictated, where do we go next, what's the tempo, how are we going to conduct the operations. Our role was clearly to provide advice into that, and that is, that's about advice at all levels. So it would be General Townsend working with Prime Minister Abadi, all the way down through to the lowest levels of giving tactical advice on the ground. And I think one of the things that has been a real hallmark of this mission is it has not been foreign militaries telling indigenous forces what to do. It really hasn't. The more the Iraqis have got back into their stride, it really has been them dictating the pace, dictating the design. We have given wise counsel, we've given options, but we have in no way sought to dictate to Prime Minister Abadi or indeed his generals how they might force how they might conduct the fight. And the phrase I used to always like to use, it's more about listening than it is about talking. It's about giving them a platform through which they can play around with ideas, talk about the ideas, and then give them some wise advice as to how they might optimise their own thoughts.
And if I can sort of give you a perspective from the air component. So the overall coalition air component, commanded by a 3-star United States Air Force general from the Air Operations Centre in Qatar, UK air assets support his mission, and he, as General Rupert was saying, is absolutely working to the coalition. What I would say is, because there's a temptation, so just to sort of pick up one of the earlier questions, to do the counting of things, and that is obviously important up to an extent. But one of the things which I would offer that the UK really has been able to apply is a sort of a different approach, some alternative and lateral thinking. And if I give just maybe one vignette from the end of 2016, where Iraqi forces were finding they're going very hard in Mosul due to vehicle-borne improvised explosive devices, VBIEDs, which Daesh were fielding daily in large numbers. And one of the approaches could have been, we'll try and find all the VBIEDs and take them out, and there's an element of that. But what we were also able to discover, due to some excellent work by a number of UK folk, military and interagency, was we were able to see the importance that Daesh's use of commercial drones was to allow them to actually coordinate and apply command and control. So what we actually did was effectively go into that network and find out what it constituted, both at the front line and where it was being supported, and then offer a proposal back into the coalition of how we'd go about going after it, which we then very successfully did in the very early part of 2017, directly supporting Iraqi security forces on the ground and fully integrated with the coalition land component and the coalition task force HQ.
I know you mentioned working with, there were 30 other nations involved militarily, General Jones. How difficult was it to work with those 30 nations? So some would have been involved on the ground, some may have been involved in the air. I wonder if you could just say a little bit about that.
Yeah, I'm not going to paraphrase Churchill's quotes about alliances and not alliances, but of course, there are challenges in drawing together 30 militaries that very rightly to come together with, if you like, 30 sets of national policy that have to be woven together into a coalition. But I would actually turn that challenge into a strength. I think we'd all recognise that Daesh poses a global threat, and therefore you've got to take a global approach to it. I think we all felt that the greatest strength we had was our strength in numbers, both on a global coalition perspective, but also on a military coalition perspective. It helped to prevent any sense of or mitigate any kind of accusations of foreign powers coming in and imposing themselves. So are there challenges? Yes, of course there are. But those are entirely manageable. And I think one of the powers of a coalition is to ensure you're as inclusive as you can be. There are always, every nation has security classifications. Every nation has the things it wishes to do and doesn't wish to do. In the same way as the United Kingdom, its government would have its particular aspirations for this mission. Same with all the other nations. But it's actually surprisingly easy to weave it together, because fundamentally we've all signed up to be part of the military coalition. And again, I would defer back to my earlier comments about the United States leadership. So our high headquarters, in the absence of, in this particular mission, there wasn't a NATO mission or any other alliance that was providing it. So the higher level military command came out of US Central Command in Tampa, which the coalition nations all signed up to. So there was a pretty mature network to bind the coalition together, both at military level and at political level. I mentioned that I used to go to the Global Coalition meetings, and that's a really important mechanism by which you work with the nations and make sure that you have a common narrative, a common perspective. You allow nations to air their particular observations, concerns, aspirations, and that's a healthy thing, because that's holding everybody to account. And so I would absolutely observe that the weaving in the 30 nations as it pertained to the military coalition was a huge strength.
There would have been differences there are differences in rules of engagement. If we're talking about airstrikes, how did you manage to bring the coalition together in terms of airstrikes, in terms of rules of engagement?
Extraordinarily straightforward, because all nations come with a policy wrap. And so as a nation comes in, you understand exactly what they can and cannot do, and then you weave that into the overall total mission. So you wouldn't invite a nation that doesn't have permissions to operate in Syria to conduct an airstrike over Syria for sake of argument. You wouldn't invite a training team to go somewhere within Iraq where it is quite clear its nation hasn't given it the policy permissions to do that. And so you just accept it and you weave around it, and in no way did I feel, as the officer responsible for the overall coalition line of operation, that it was a constraint.
Vice Marshal String, you talked about intelligence sharing. You were talking about drones, and you were talking about all the information in terms of the air operation. How did we share intelligence? How was intelligence shared? Do you think that was shared in a way that was successful? How would you judge that? And particularly on the drone issue, I wonder if you could say some more, because you did say commercial drones as opposed to consumer drones.
Yeah, so if I just clarify that bit to start, that's Daesh fielding commercially bought, 700 quid drones bought off the internet effectively at a pretty industrial scale. In terms of our intelligence support, I think there's two sort of big headlines, I guess, and then right to your point. The first is we were able to put everything that we had into it. So that is whether it be the E3 aircraft to support our awareness of what's going on in the air environment, to aid deconfliction as well as the flow of sorties. A whole raft of imagery and signals intelligence aircraft, whether they be manned like our Rivet Joint or unmanned like our Reaper drones, our unmanned air systems. The really important bit is that's great if you collect a whole load of information, it's what you do with it. So one of the key UK contributions has been the quality and number of our intelligence analysts that we have put into this, and our ability to reach across various agencies in the UK, because it's more than just a bit of video or it's more just a snippet of a transcript. It's how you fuse all of that together. In terms of a coalition sharing of it, it's a matter of record, of course, that there is a Five Eyes community. The most important bit is that what the coalition, even if it wasn't in that Five Eyes community, and there are obviously levels of classification of intelligence that's shared, but everybody got what was required for the mission, even when it had to forced us to sort of go into some quite novel places of not necessarily revealing sources or how we got the information, but being able to get the information out so people were able to employ it. And I think a telling statistic, and also a little bit that goes with it, our Sentinel standoff radar provided about 25 to 30% of the overall coalition contribution of an absolutely key capability. It's telling you what's going on the ground, allows you to put our aircraft to have a look at it. That's fine, but coming back to what you do with it. So the product that our men and women produced became the exemplar for the coalition in that particular field. Why does that matter? Because it's not just knowing what's going on, but to pick up what Rupert was saying earlier, it also allows for the best decisions to be made in the coalition as well. So you're actively informing the decision-making and decision support. And again, to come back to a sort of, so where does this sort of add value almost in a way or show UK influence? I'd say just that one small vignette, one aircraft, a few people supporting it, and an utterly disproportionate impact on what it actually provided for the coalition.
Just finally on that intelligence in the Raqqa campaign, obviously you would have had issues deconflicting with Russia, the airspace. How did you manage that?
Right. So I think at the outset, I've been involved in frontline duties for about 25 years. It is the most complex airspace and overall battle space, including all of the environments any of us can remember, full stop. So a very challenging environment to operate within. You'll know that there's a deconfliction hotline in the Air Operations Centre with the Russians, and at the height of my time, when it was the busiest airspace in the region, at times that was being used around 15 or so times a day to deconflict missions. And it was professional. It was a little bit emotional at times, but it was a professional means of deconflicting the activity. But again, coming back to judgment and just how dynamic the environment is, and I realise I might sound like a bit of a sort of sub-Tom Clancy novel here, but we're talking about speeds where people are closing at 1,000 miles an hour, where we're covering a mile in 3 seconds between aircraft. So this is a sort of decision space for dynamic environment requiring people to make really timely, crunchy calls and get them consistently right. And I think we should probably reflect on the fact that people were getting it consistently right day after day in a very, very challenging environment.
And if I may, just worth observing that, of course, there was also a ground deconfliction channel as well. So as our partner forces in Syria, with our advisors, coalition advisors, started to close towards the Euphrates River, where regime forces with Russian partners and others were operating again, we put in place a separate deconfliction channel with the Russians again to ensure that ground deconfliction, because in the same way as Jonny describes aircraft closing in on each other at great speed, put that in a land environment, you have partner forces staring across, in some instances, a hillside at regime forces backed by the Russians. So sometimes they were firmly within small arms range of each other. So again, you need deconfliction to ensure that everyone's safety.
Okay. Before we move on, I'd just like to pick up a couple of points that have come up previously. General Jones, you did say earlier that the UK had broader permissions than other countries. Can you just elaborate what that means?
Yes, I don't want to go too far into that. But in terms of what some of the capabilities the United Kingdom can operate, we're a high intensity, high end warfighting military with some extremely sophisticated capabilities, and ensuring that we can use those effectively. But as in this forum, I wouldn't wish to go too much further with that regard. But it has a slightly more prosaic element to it as well. So we talked a bit about building partner capacity. The platform for the Iraqi success was taking the Iraqi brigades, putting them back to training, re-equipping them, largely funded by the United States, and then sending them back to the battlefield. That was significantly conducted in training locations behind the wire, a long way from the battlefield. Increasingly, as the Iraqis advanced north towards Mosul and elsewhere, they didn't want to come all the way back to the schoolhouse. They wanted the training to come to them. And the United Kingdom was one of the nations that was absolutely at the forefront of answering the call of moving training teams further forward to provide that assistance.
And Chairman, I can try and help a little bit from the air environment. And as Rupert said, absolutely, very obviously some very obvious operational security sensitivities around rules of engagement. But if I can just sort of try and flesh out one example where we can perhaps talk to permissions, and that would be where, and it's actually a standing ROE anyway, we would always seek to delegate to the lowest practical level. Why? Because in most occasions those nearest for fight can often have the highest level of what we call SA, situational awareness. And if I think to our Tornado and our Typhoon crews, but also our Reaper crews, where they are getting not just a very high quality visual feed off targeting pods that they've got, but they've also got very high situational awareness from other intelligence feeds about where they're operating. And we have the confidence in the crews because they've been doing this for years, whether it be in Libya, Iraq, Afghanistan and elsewhere. And we have very proven processes for it. So it's that sort of level of permission where you have the confidence, the training, the professionalism, the overall wrapper of technology and procedure that allows you to. There will be other air forces that for some reasons may not be able to operate in that same way. So that puts us at a level that is of greater utility.
Can I ask you a little bit more about the political interaction that you had in each of the two countries? So you said that in Iraq you obviously were closely engaged with the government. In Syria, obviously that didn't apply, but you said that you would work in close cooperation with the leadership of the Syrian Democratic Forces. Were there any other major actors in Syria with whom you cooperated in that way, or was it primarily the Syrian Democratic Forces?
So in terms of the defeat of Daesh in Syria, you know that it took a little bit of time to identify partners that we could have confidence in, that had the suitable objectives and the sort of capability to do the what was needed. And the Syrian Democratic Forces were clearly the dominant element of that, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But there were some other smaller partner forces who we worked with down in southern Syria. I say we, I mean the coalition, as opposed to the United Kingdom specifically. So the coalition was working with some partner forces down in southern Syria, the MAT and the Shuk. I can give you the full names if you'd like later, but they're long and pretty unpronounceable. Who we were working down in southern Syria. But up in the area east of the Euphrates, the ground that people tend to focus on, the ground that led you to Raqqa, Mayadin, Deir ez-Zor, and elsewhere. Clearly, the Syrian Democratic Forces were the prime force. So, who were we dealing with in Syria? We were dealing on a military level with an individual called General Mazloum. He is the commander of the Syrian Democratic Forces. He is a Kurd by background, and you will, I'm sure, know the Syrian Democratic Forces are made up of two components. The Kurdish-dominated element of the force, called the YPG, and he is YPG by background, and then the Syrian Arab Coalition. And what General Mazloum was able to do was act as kingmaker between those groups. And as we went deeper towards Raqqa, into what is traditionally an increasingly Arab area, clearly the fighters had to be more and more Arab. You know, if you're going to liberate an Arab village, it really needs to be coming from Arab fighters. And by the time we went into Raqqa, the Syrian Democratic Forces, about 80% of the fighters were actually Syrian Arab Coalition as opposed to the Kurdish force. So we're dealing very closely with General Mazloum and his subordinates as the fighting force. But we were also dealing with, and I had extensive dealings with the local councils in the absence of a sovereign government. So particularly the Raqqa Civil Council, who were formed up in readiness for the liberation of the province to provide it initial governance.
So at its height, when we were operating in Syria with airstrikes, we did, up till March of this year, we had 333 airstrikes in Syria. Would you say that the overwhelming majority of those airstrikes in Syria were in support of the Syrian Democratic Forces?
Question. I defer to my British colleague.
No, absolutely. So I'll talk to October 17, if I may, Chairman, because that was my cut-off point. But yes, absolutely. So our airstrikes in Syria are in support of the SDF on the ground.
Thank you very much. Leo.
Thank you, Chairman. Vice Marshal, can you describe how you controlled airstrikes and how you ensured that targets were legitimate?
Yes, thank you. And so from a UK angle, three broad pillars, I would say, that our approach to targeting and our execution of strikes rests on. So the first of which, and I'll go into this in a little bit more detail in a moment, is really the sophistication in our targeting enterprise, and I'll unpack that in a moment. The second is, frankly, the professionalism and judgment of everybody who's involved in that, whether that is from our imagery analysts identifying targets and plotting coordinates, right through to the crews who are actually flying the missions themselves. The third point is actually the level of scrutiny and the standard to which we've held ourselves. And I don't say that idly. I think I probably referred 3 to 4 airstrikes a month back to the UK, because on post-strike analysis we'd look at something and go, do you know what? Did we actually see that at the time of the strike? May there have been some figures that appeared at the top of a frame on a targeting pod that weren't apparent at the time. Let's understand what happened on the ground, and we would go back and do that. And equally, you will note, and we may come back to this, but we have been utterly transparent with Air Wars and with others on what we've done with our strikes, to the extent actually that we would, in consultation with the permanent joint headquarters staff back in the UK, assess every CENTCOM report that would come through to check and test whether there was UK involvement, and if there was any possibility that there was, then we'd absolutely look into the investigation, try and work out if we were there. But let me come back to the first point, sophistication in the enterprise, because I do think this is important. I'm not sure we've actually ever built anything so sophisticated as what we've had to use in Iraq and Syria. So if I could put you into the Air Operations Centre around the UK desk, you'd find a team, largely young men and women, imagery analysts, intelligence, targeting support, legal advice, policy advice, all overseen by a relatively senior individual. taking a whole number of feeds that are coming in to assess, first order, is it a valid military target? Is it part of Daesh or the target set that we're going after? Does it satisfy the rules of engagement? Does it satisfy UK policy? Is there clear military advantage? And all those levels are effectively a check and a balance on what we're doing.
Do you have someone on the ground giving you intelligence? Do you have forward air controllers, as it were?
So the coalition had, if it's American speak, it would be a JTAC, a Joint Tactical Air Controller, so a team forward. They are providing targeting information, but they are one of numerous feeds that are coming in. They may be the preeminent one, depending on the nature of the fight we're in. But we would take that would come through a strike cell at one of 2 gusting 3 locations in the theatre, and then the team on the desk, as I've just described, will be having that discussion with the strike cell to work out exactly what the target is, its validity, its compliance with UK ROE, etc. So a very in-depth process, but done at pace as well, because you cannot hang around. But to give you a sense of where those checks and balances are, in a 6-month period for one of our red card holders at the back end of 2016, of around 1,000 requests that came in, he approved around 400 or so, and we actually struck about 280. So over 50% fail a test. By the way, part of that may well be because the situation on the ground has changed, and things do change. Mosul, highly dynamic fight, incredibly congested urban area, a lot going on, and making sure we were getting the calls right was an absolutely the guiding principle for UK targeting. Hopefully that's enough.
Thank you very much. I shall now come to Madeline.
I wonder, Marshal, can you tell us, did the UK always have the capability and the flexibility to cover the range of missions that we were asked to undertake, or were there times when we had to pass them on to someone else?
No, I think we had sort of come back to the fact of us being able to field a balanced capability. So did I have the assets, the aircraft and the weapons? Yeah, in an unlimited world you would ask for more, and people always do. But in terms of the fight we were in and what we needed to employ against it, in the very broad handfuls, yes. In terms of ability to carry out the job, again, I'd almost sort of turn it on its head, if I may, and say we brought capabilities into the fight that some people didn't have, whether that was augmenting stuff that may be solely American because of where it is, or indeed an approach that was almost uniquely British that we could play in, which was a combination of both aircraft and, as I was saying, with the understanding and some of that interagency fusing of intelligence that allowed us to provide some particular insights that would allow the campaign to be prosecuted.
Were there particular targets that we focused on, or were we targeting across the board? Was there a speciality in a sense that we were able to provide?
And if I just give a UK perspective, because I think that's obviously appropriate, we absolutely went across the breadth of Daesh's organisation. So whether that be fighters who were pinning down Iraqi security forces in Mosul, whether it be vehicle-borne IEDs being constructed in rural areas, whether it be understanding, even if we weren't going after it kinetically, which is an important point, using our intelligence to build out what Daesh as themselves proclaiming a sort of proto-state. Well, okay, let's have a look at you. Let's have a look at your finances. Let's have a look at how you're doing your, frankly, propaganda and command and control and recruiting. And then let's see how we can go after and undermine all those elements of you. So bringing an array of the obvious sort of kinetic stuff, but some of the more sophisticated, perhaps non-kinetics, which might not be so apparent. Sorry, Rupert, I didn't want to sort of talk on a coalition, but that was the UK side.
No, I'll leave it at that.
We tend to think of combat operations as always being kinetic. So how many of our missions were non-combat? How many, was it 50%, 30%? Have you any idea?
So I'd have to go back with you the exact split of sorties, but if I can give you a flavour within each sort of type. So just because a pair of strike aircraft or a Reaper was on a mission carrying weapons didn't mean it was going to be dropping weapons on that mission. So Of the, I think now approaching 4,000 weapons of all different types have been delivered from the air environment. Actually, if you divided those by the number of sorties, you'd actually probably get a 0-point reading rather than a 1 point whatever. The intelligence and surveillance side of it, our Reapers providing a couple of Reapers on call every day to look in Iraq and Syria, tasked for the coalition. And our wide-bodied intelligence aircraft absolutely flowing into other coalition assets. But again, just one little figure, I think, and it always comes back to UK influence and how we support the wider coalition. Our tanker aircraft, the Voyager, was, depending where you take the chop on this, actually fueling between 30 and 50% of its gas every day, its fuel, was being given to coalition, so non-UK aircraft. That's actually a really helpful contribution when other people don't have tanker aircraft and they're really hurting for fuel. So being able to bring a lot of fuel into the fight every day for ourselves and our allies was really important.
And I think there's an interesting element to that as well. So we talked a bit earlier about the numbers of troops in Iraq, 600 British. Jonny's touched on the balance between offensive and supporting missions. But in terms of the amount of British service personnel supporting the counter-Daesh fight in the round, in the region, that's 1,400. So the figure skyrockets, and I don't know how many of them were pilots, but it begins to give you a sense of the ratios. It's not all about the kinetic element. It's about all the supporting functions that go on.
Do you feel that you had sufficient resources to sustain operations at the tempo that was required, particularly without impacting on Harmony guidelines?
Can I start on that from a coalition perspective, and then Jonny can talk about it from a Royal Air Force perspective. And he touched on this a moment ago. As a military commander, you're always going to want more. Mass has a power all of its own, and the ground commander's job is to make his case to the higher level of command, and then it'll perfectly correctly hit the political level, and you'll be allocated resources. But we, the military, are always going to want more. We're not going to want to go into an attack with any less than we can avoid. So, did my boss feel he had everything he needed? Yes. Did he and his Air Force colleague always make the case for more? Yes, because the more you've got, the faster the tempo you can go. And I touched earlier the fact that the operational design was the design of our partners, and therefore the pace of the campaign is again being dictated by our partners. And what we didn't want was to be the drag anchor on Prime Minister Bardi. We didn't want to be the drag anchor going into Raqqa. And General Townsend he was very good at kind of breaking things down into simple ways of visualising things. He would make the point that he could support 3.5 fights at a time across Iraq and Syria. Mosul was certainly one fight. Raqqa was a fight. Sometimes they were a fight and a half because they got so intense. And so he would when he was looking at what else can I do, Prime Minister Bardi wants to do X, can I resource it? He would always come back to, I've got about enough resource in the air component, in his enablers, all his advisors, to about 3.5 different things at a time. So they're always resource constraints to some degree. The Iraqis, of course, were themselves limited.
Yeah, and thanks. And if I'd sort of try and set the UK's the air contribution shader against the wider context of everything else, which the government asks us to do in our other commitments around the world, we were right-sized for the contribution to shader pretty much. Some of our areas undoubtedly running hot. No two ways about it. We ask a lot of our intelligence and surveillance forces. And we don't have a large number of assets. That was always designed into the buy of things. So, for example, the rivet joint I mentioned, we the third one of 3 arrived during my time in tenure. Reaper, we got to the place where it was sustainable at the lines we wanted to do. There always is a tension, by the way, in every campaign to sort of front load everything at the start and then repent at leisure because you've put it all out of, in my case, the hangar. And we were able to sustain our fast jet contribution whilst also doing our southern air policing and our UK air defence and other responsibilities. But could we have done any more? Something would have had to have given if we'd like to have put more into Shader. Because coming back to your specific question on harmony, we ask a lot of folk. We have tornado engineers on Cyprus who, at their 3-year point of view operation, some had already done over a year there, servicing aircraft, come rain or shine, in support of the fight. And in fact, we made sure that the GR4 force was and is able to sustain its commitment right up to the end of the operation, but that meant a focus on the operation to make sure it could be given what it deserved. What I should also mention, just briefly, is your question also, I think, indirectly highlights the importance of having aircraft that you can actually flex from one mission to another. So a Reaper can be doing intelligence and surveillance, and then it can go and do a strike. A Typhoon could be doing, and by the way, that would be the same for a Tornado. A Typhoon, as happened on a few occasions, we put up to do effectively a strike-type mission if required, but then we actually folded it into providing air defence support, if I can call it that. And I think the longest mission in my time was 8.5 hours for a Typhoon that went up to do Mission A, did Mission A, and then got asked to do the air defence mission straight after it as well. So those sort of investments and the choices we made in the past, it was great to be able to exploit that. And again, coming back to value to coalition, that aircraft or platforms that can do more than one thing are genuinely useful to commanders.
Thank you for mentioning the important role of ground crew, because we're very conscious of that, and it's nice to see it able to be impacted and going into the evidence that this committee will take. Thank you for that. One of the things that everyone always focuses on is how often you're pulled back from carrying out missions because of civilian presence. And there is a major focus on civilian casualties where we have undertaken strikes. But there's also the issue of where we've pulled back and actually we shouldn't. So how often is the analysis also looking at where our rules of engagement, perhaps not ours, but an ally's rules of engagement, have prevented action that if we'd actually acted, we would have been more effective and perhaps saved more lives in the longer term? Is that part of the equation that we're looking at? Because I am worried that too often the focus is on, was there a mistake made there in terms of civilian casualties, rather than was there a mistake made there and actually we could have done more effective mission that would have had a better outcome longer term for people on the ground.
Shall I start and then perhaps Jonny can follow up?
Can I just mention before you do that we will be going into this in more detail in the next question as well. So if you keep this as a very brief overview, and the next question will enable you to...
Okay, well, why don't I hold my fire then for the moment? Jonny, do you want to do it specific?
Yeah, so it's difficult in a way because it's almost counterfactual. Because you don't know what would have happened after the event, if that makes sense. An airstrike will set a number of other events into train after it. To the specific of, would I have liked greater freedoms, permissions? Well, let me give you the right of arc, perhaps, for where that takes you. And that takes you to what the Russians have been doing in places like Aleppo, where actually they aren't beholden to the same quite right strictures as we are, where 90% of their weapons are unguided, where drop from medium level they frankly miss by hundreds of feet because that's the accuracy from medium level. I think I would speak for everybody who served in my group actually, which is to say we were at the end of the day always wanting to be able to look ourselves in the mirror and be happy with what we saw about how we'd gone about our business, and I think we can say that.
Madeleine, Phil?
I just want to go back to something you said earlier, Vice Marshal, about the finances of ISIS, that you went after those as well. Can you give an example of actually what that means?
Right, Ruth could probably actually give you the numbers in detail. Let me start it off and then I'll hand off. So this is understanding where Daesh's financial flows are coming from. So, Daesh was not run on the equivalent of sort of, £5 a day. They were everything from, effectively remittances through to theft, through to bank robberies, whatever you like, oil, a classic one. And talking finance, you see a nexus of a whole number of areas. There's considerable overlap. So understanding where those flows were, in this case financial flows, what was contributing to them, and then identifying how you would go after it. And some of it may be how you go after it in the financial sector. Nothing to do with the weapon here, but some of the intelligence that people are providing will provide start points for that, through to actually elements of their oil and gas, particularly oil, that actually we may want to target because it's directly funding military operations. So that's the sort of slice I was looking at, and there are other elements as well. But I'll hand off through.
So in macro terms, it's worth just stepping back from the military coalition, which of course was a component of what I described as the global coalition. And the global coalition, I think, some real genius in this, because it recognised that Daesh was much more than just a military force holding a caliphate. It was about an ideology, it had networks, it was seeking inspiration, it was seeking recruits from Europe, from the Middle East, from elsewhere. And so what the global coalition was seeking to do was to take a global approach to it, but also to, if you like, attack the enemy across their fronts. So that meant that there was a foreign fighter element to the global coalition, there was a counter-finance element to the global coalition, there's a stabilisation element, there was a global communications element of the coalition. And it's worth just touching on that last one first, then I'll come back to finances. So the global communications cell was run out, sponsored by the United Kingdom, run out of the Foreign Office here, an international body, but sponsored and hosted by the United Kingdom. And for me, it was one of the most powerful bits of the coalition, because it recognised that Daesh was fundamentally about an idea. It was an ideology. And as you know, back in 2014 and 2015, Daesh were very clever with their use of social media. They portrayed themselves as being somehow a glamorous organisation. Their rallying call struck a chord with people all over the world. What the Global Communications Cell was able to do over time was to firstly physically take down Daesh's propaganda, and we on a military perspective supported that. So their propaganda has now been reduced from about over 80% from its all-time high. But in a way, the cleverer bit was about helping people to recognise, particularly in the region, to recognise that Daesh was not glamorous, that what they were doing was calling you to your death, and it was a brutal, evil organisation. And what it allowed people to do was, if like what I described as the voice of tolerance and moderation, to have their say and begin to drown out the voice of hatred. So it's really important to set the military fight in a broader context. So what that meant in terms of the finance work, some of it sits way outside the military coalition in terms of governments working in finances, and I'm not best placed to comment on that. But what the US element of the coalition in particular did very hard was to target finance sources in country, particularly in Syria. And one of the biggest cash cows for Daesh was their oil flow. So cutting off their access to oil was absolutely fundamental to undermining their finances.
I just want to move on to estimates on civilian casualties, etc. How did you seek to prevent civilian casualties or collateral damage from airstrikes? How did you seek to prevent civilian casualties or collateral damage from airstrikes?
So if I start from a broad perspective, and then Jonny can tell you what it feels like, for the team actually delivering the attacks. So it plays to the earlier question. And when the first thing, as Jonny alluded to, we want to be constrained. We're a democratic force. We want to be governed by the law of armed conflict. That's our overriding legal framework. And therefore, do we want a situation where we have greater freedoms to prosecute the enemy even more ruthlessly? well, we'd still be constrained by the law of armed conflict, which is what, when Jonny and I look ourselves in the mirror at night, that's what we have to judge ourselves against. And so, that must be our metric. If we don't do that, then frankly, we're no better than the Russians. As Jonny has already indicated, they took a different approach. And we are no better, if we're not careful, than the enemy we are seeking to defeat. So I think that would be the first thing to say. The second would be to say that our partners in both Iraq and Syria care deeply about civilian casualties. They're their people. If you ever wanted to see a general who cared about this, you had to go and spend time with Lieutenant General Abdul Amir, who was Prime Minister Abadi's ground commander, who fought the Battle of Mosul. He has fought all the other battles too, but here's the one who fought the Battle of Mosul. He literally carried the city of Mosul on his shoulders. 1.75 million people for 9 months. He cared passionately about those people. He would have loved the city to be empty, because he could have then prosecuted it, and all his concern would have been about damage to buildings. But it wasn't empty, it was full of people, and he had to, day in, day out, put his own troops at greater risk to minimise the risk to civilian casualties. So our partner, who we were supporting, was, even if we weren't in that place, the conscience coming out of General Abdul Amir, coming out of Prime Minister Abadi, was very, very strong. And I would say the same in Syria. So General Mazloum, who I touched on, was very mindful as he went towards Raqqa that Raqqa was predominantly an Arab city. That made him even more cautious. Were he an Arab, he might have felt freer to go, well, I'm an Arab, it's an Arab city, it's my city, I can be a bit more aggressive. And it's not the stance he took. He took quite the reverse. It is an Arab city, I'm a Kurd, I therefore must be even more careful in my approach. So that our partners took a hugely enlightened approach to this. And I think the last thing I'd say before I hand over to Jonny is, we just need to be really careful, don't we? That, war's brutal. And if you want to fight in cities, everything is more extreme. Everything is heightened. The amount of troops you need, the amount of munitions you drop, the amount of suffering, everything is heightened in a city. So the idea that you could liberate a city like Mosul, or indeed Raqqa, without, tragically, civilian casualties is a fool's errand. That the civilian casualties have been so low, not least by the United Kingdom, is testament to the extraordinary professionalism of the entire endeavour. But every time a civilian is killed, ultimately, he or she is the indirect victim of Daesh.
So I spoke a little bit about Mosul. Just sort of flesh that out. It's about the size of Nottingham, 1.2 million people before the start of the op to liberate. A density like some of the inner London boroughs, and some parts of it look like the shambles in York with that sort of age and density and confusion. So, and to pick up Rupert's point, you can be as precise as you like, but at the end of the day, war is a nasty and it's a brutal business. But our entry point for our strikes was 0 civilian casualties. We would hone every element of intelligence we could find to give us the best possible understanding before we went after a strike. There were times when we would have to act fast. I spoke about Iraqi security forces pinned down. I think the closest weapon we put into Iraqi security forces against Daesh was around 30 feet, which in cities with high explosive, that is operating incredibly close to friendly forces, and we did it successfully. But we are human and we are not perfect. And although we, with the best will in the world and with the best level of intelligence, went into all the strikes that we could take, that can't rule out the possibility that there will be some civilian casualties that at the moment we're not aware of due to UK strikes, or that there is that possibility in the future. However, what I would say is, we absolutely deal in the facts rather than conjecture. So we absolutely took every bit of evidence we got and then we drilled into it to see if there was any evidence of UK involvement. And you've also got a number of air forces, a number of countries employing weapons in relatively close areas. If you look at some of the graphics for Mosul, you'll understand that. So to be fair, absolutely getting that level of detail at sometimes is hard as well, but it hasn't stopped us doing it. So in terms of the professionals I spoke about, I won't repeat myself, but I would just say that we held ourselves to a very high standard. Might we have fallen short at times? We will find out, and we will deeply regret that. But we've achieved a hell of a lot on support of the Iraqi people and support of the SDF and others in Syria, but we've done it with the utmost professionalism.
Did you find that the procedures you followed in these strikes were you could respond effectively to rapidly evolving situations?
Yeah, I think we could. And I actually think back to when we engaged a Daesh sniper who was actually put there to shoot members of the civilian population if they wanted to try and get away from the public execution of around April, May last year. From working out what was going on to getting approval to getting the weapon on the target was very, very short, very few minutes. But why? Because we built our understanding up over a preceding 90 minutes or so, allowing us to operate fast at the time. Did we have the finest intelligence at all times? No, because you never will. Nobody has an all-seeing eye. But what we were absolutely focused on was prioritising the intelligence effort and making sure that we could always layer different intelligence feeds to give us the best understanding we could.
How many airstrikes were actually aborted because you thought there was an increase?
So there's sort of two levels to that, if I may. There's aborted when you've got a weapon in flight, and then there are those which we don't take because although we've cleared them, we then realise something has changed. Yeah. So in the actually aborted a weapon in flight, somewhere on, I think we're summed between Iraq and Syria, it's actually just below about 1%.
So you say in flight, is that still on the jet or is it actually launched?
No, the weapon's actually left the aircraft or the platform and it's guiding towards the target. And so what we're able to do with some of our weapons is actually slew the weapon away into a safe area if we notice that the conditions changed on the target. And we did that, as I said, on a few occasions, but we were looking at the target right up to the point of impact to make those judgment calls. At the other end of the spectrum is almost what I spoke about in terms of the strike request coming in and then the UK team looking at it and testing it for validity, situation on the ground, legality, UK position, etc. So at times that was obviously done in the KAOC, I sort of gave you a figure earlier, and at times in the cockpit as well, where people would be looking at stuff and going, I hear you, but I'm looking at something different at the moment. I'm looking at 20 civilians who've just come in. Right, okay, just abort the strike.
And what proportion of airstrikes went wrong, where there might have been a weapon that malfunctioned, for example?
What I wouldn't like to do, if I can sort of reassure by saying very, very low numbers, and we also actually, whenever we realised that a weapon had not gone, and it wasn't that often, had not gone where intended, we would actually put a significant amount of work in to try and work out, obviously what happened, but also where that weapon might have guided to. I wouldn't like to give the figures because they are operationally sensitive, but it's very, very low.
Graham, do you want to come in briefly?
Just briefly, we hear a lot about the civilian casualties being as a result of human shields and the difficult operational decisions that you have to make. Could you tell us something about the way that Daesh operated in terms of human shields or using people to defend themselves and those challenges that you faced in trying to deal with those situations?
Yes, let me take that from a kind of the higher level. You know, I think it is recognised that Daesh is an extraordinarily brutal enemy. We as a coalition would downplay that often. Why? Because otherwise we're just echoing what Daesh want us to do. They want to be known as a brutal organisation. So the more we trumpet just how brutal and the diabolical things they've done, you to some degree, perverse though it may sound, you're doing Daesh's job for them. So we used to downplay that quite significantly. But people should be under no illusion as to what they were doing in Ramadi and Fallujah, in all the places they held, and then in this case in Mosul. You know, they enslaved entire populations. You know, they went through living hell. And what does that look like in reality? Well, you know, you're in the grip of fear. People are being murdered constantly for doing, the smallest thing wrong. Once the battle was joined, they were being actively starved to death. Just no food. The food was all going to the fighters, none of it going to the population. They were being, I kid you not, being thrown into vats of burning oil. You think of the most brutal Middle Age type activity. This is what the Daesh were doing to the local population all the way through. And so the population then faces the diabolical choice. Do they try and cross the front line and hope they get across? And know that in doing so they may well be mown down, and they were mown down in very large numbers by Daesh as they seek to cross the front line with their families? Or do they try and live it out? And if they live it out, they're living in these absolutely diabolical conditions. And I would say that Daesh went beyond human shields. They weaponized the entire population. And what that meant in instances, and we touched earlier, I think, on the degree to which Daesh might use our own limitation on taking life, our own moral Western values against us. So they would, for example, we had plenty of evidence of them shepherding large numbers of people into buildings, very high numbers on some instances, then seal the building, in some instances welding people inside the building. Inside that building, not only were women and children, but they had then wired the building with explosives. They would then place a single sniper on top of that building, knowing that we would look at that as a valid target, can't see any pattern of life, there's clearly no civilians there, and then strike it. But of course would strike it with a clever munition that wouldn't destroy the entire building, it would just kill the sniper and perhaps the first floor. But if you put an explosive in there, I'm no weaponeer, Jonny, I'm getting into Jonny's territory, the sympathetic detonation of all the explosions in the building will bring down the building and kill everybody inside it. Clear evidence of them doing that. And we, of course, then adjusted, we learnt from that, and we worked very, very hard to make sure that we didn't fall into those sort of traps. But this is an enemy using a population in a way that, as I can only liken to the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages.
Yes, you've described quite a lot with regard to Mosul and how you were resolving these various conflicts. Could you just describe to us what was actually the extent of UK military involvement, and also how does the Mosul operation compare to previous UK operations?
So I'm going to touch briefly. So UK, the second most significant contributor to the campaign. Jonny will give you the numbers of aircraft and the air effect. But what that meant on the ground, what was our contribution? Well, it was about senior leadership, people like me. It was staff in all of the key headquarters in designing how the coalition would support our partners. Very well trusted and valued British staff from all three services doing that. And then inside Iraq, conducting really the kind of the base layer of the campaign, which was building partner capacity. So the 600 troops inside Iraq, the bulk of whom were involved in building partner capacity, and that is about taking the Iraqi forces at a low level up to the brigade level and training them, giving them the skills that they needed to go back into the battle. And that is everything from generalist training, so infantry skills, through more specialist training, such as medical training, engineering training, and then counter-improvised explosive device training. So you know that I think is at the heart of the support we provided, and then I'll allow Jonny to comment from an air perspective.
Yeah, I mean, sort of to reinforce perhaps a couple of points earlier, I think we would all think that Mosul and Raqqa are probably the most challenging environments to conduct weaponeering and airstrikes in and operate over for decades. I can't actually think of a more challenging urban area, to be honest, especially set against that framework of permissions and ROE that we've spoken about. And we had to be clever, and we had to be imaginative about some of the things we were doing. So the brimstone is a very, very clever weapon. We procured it as an anti-armour weapon. We ended up using it to take out sniper teams of 2 people by putting the missile through the roof of a corner of a 3-storey building in the middle of an incredibly densely packed urban area. But we had the confidence to do it because of the crews and targeting and because of the weapon itself. But you can't do that unless you're a top-tier Air Force and you're practicing at it and you have confidence in your people as well as your equipment. I could give other examples where we did some very clever work with fusing on larger weapons so that we mitigated the effect of them effectively. We used buildings or parts of buildings to contain the blast. Why? Because it was obvious that you couldn't have, your words have to match your deeds. And if you have a narrative that talks about, quite rightly, the importance of human life, the avoidance of civilian casualties, and then actually you go and prosecute a war in a different way, your credibility runs out pretty quickly, and quite rightly so as well. So having to go after and operate with that level of sophistication and judgment day after day is quite tiring for folk, and I think they did an exceptionally sound job. In fact, better than a sound job, they did an excellent job in being able to stay with that. I think one of the things which is quite useful to reflect on, of course, is I don't think any of us would have thought in 2013, right, you're going to be in an operation for almost 4 years conducting strikes in a whole raft of areas, desert areas, kind of used to that, right through to incredibly challenging urban areas, and making sure that all of the various forces were up to the challenge, that our training was appropriate to it, that to pick up an earlier point, we made sure that it was sustainable as well. And one of the points I would make there is what you have to do is make sure that you are being sensible in husbanding things as well. Again, best one in the world, and I'd include the US in this, even they at times don't have everything that they want at hand. And so being sensible about how you employ weapons, the judgment in it, is all part of that tapestry of getting it right. I think all of us, all of the militaries who've been involved in this fight have learnt an incredibly large amount from it, which we are already applying.
And if I may, forgive me, I didn't really answer the second part of your question, which was about the Mosul operation itself. I mean, I don't think any military in living memory has encountered a battle of this nature. I've said regularly, and I stand ready to challenge, but I cannot think of a more significant urban battle since the Second World War. So any military, this is uncharted territory, and your reference points, you're going back to battles like Stalingrad, Battle of Berlin, to find some of your reference points. So we as a coalition, in all the environments, we're learning a vast amount. So were our partners. And I have to say, having spent a lot of time with them, I think the Iraqi security forces deserve extraordinary credit for sustaining what was an absolutely brutal battle. I mean, the mind boggles fighting a single urban battle for 9 months, with a short pause of under a month between the battles of East and West Mosul. It beggars belief. So we've all got a vast amount to learn from it, and I can absolutely reassure you that the militaries are picking over the bones of the battle to make sure we all learn for the future.
Thank you. This is all excellent stuff. The only slight problem we have is that, as you know, we have to finish in about 3/4 of an hour, and we're only just about at the halfway stage. So we're not far adrift, but we're a little bit adrift, so I think we all need to just speed up a touch. John, are you okay with any further questions?
No, that's
You're
fine.
okay. Right, we'll move on to Ruth then.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. Given we're now talking directly about Mosul, how successful were our airstrikes, Air Vice Marshal?
In terms of contributing to the coalition campaign to liberate the city, exceptionally effective. By the sense of, were we aiding Iraqi security force movement on the ground? Yes, right through to, were we also making sure that they weren't cornered and killed at times? Yeah, we absolutely were. Were we going against vehicle-borne IEDs? Yes, so therefore assisting with Iraqi security force movement. Were we also operating elsewhere beyond the obvious places to prevent unfettered flow of more fighters, explosive material, etc. into the city? Yeah, we were doing that as well. And we were also providing key elements of the intelligence that directed the targeting, that allowed better command decisions to be made. We were doing that as well, and at the same time helping out our coalition allies both in the intelligence space and also, as I said, even down to refuelling some of their aircraft. So it's a really good point, though. Measures of effectiveness, militaries have always struggled with them, and at times they're more apparent in the rear-view mirror than actually where you were. Did Mosul operate at a seamless, steady tempo from east to west? No, it didn't. Was it a more jagged line with pauses, the occasional very slight reversal? Yep, and that's warfare. But in terms of what we were able to support and provide, we were absolutely giving the Iraqi security forces what was required for the fight. So I think our men and women did a fantastic job and provided what was required.
Major General, in terms of other operations that were, or our land forces, our intelligence gathering, how successful do you believe them to have been in supporting?
Wider British contribution? Yeah, I mean, hugely successful. So, we haven't really talked that much about it, but, the absolute platform for this Iraqi success was retraining their forces. And, that's something that the British stepped up to right at the front end of the campaign. And as I touched on, arguably you could say, well, any military could do that. But we pride ourselves in Britain that our military is a world-leading military. And there is no doubt that the Iraqis wanted to be trained by British forces. So, the proof of this is in the pudding. What we were trying to do was get the Iraqi brigades good enough to liberate their country. And, the UK was fundamental to that. So the British involved in the training of about 72,000 members of the Iraqi security forces. That's a very significant percentage of the 127,000 total that we trained as a coalition. Of course, a number of nations would train a single lad as he went through bits of the training. So that has been hugely successful. That is not to say the job is done. So that Prime Minister Bardi has declared that Daesh no longer hold any territory in Iraq. But from a military perspective, subject to the desires of the Iraqi government, there's clearly more to do, because what we did is prepared the Iraqis to do the fight. What we want to do is make sure, and what Prime Minister Bardi would aspire to, is a situation where his security forces wouldn't fail in the future. So that's about putting them on a more sustainable footing going on into the future.
Okay, thank you. Graham.
Major General, you said earlier on that the...
Oh, I'm sorry, Graham. My fault. Madeline wants to come in at that point. Forgive me.
Sorry. One of the things that this evidence session has been able to do has been able to give not just the committee but the wider public an understanding of the amazing work really the British Armed Forces have undertaken and the depth of expertise and professionalism that you've brought to bear, as well as the skills base that we all are deeply proud of. There are, however, a group that we don't acknowledge and that get no airtime, in a sense. We're aware of the death of Macton Rowe, for example, our special forces. So I know generally we do not relate and refer to special forces. But are you able to say anything about how critical their role was, both in ground operations and intelligence gathering? Because we are aware that they must have been pretty important.
Well, I think in a way you answered your own question. So you will recognise what the British position is on that, and we don't comment on special forces. What I can tell you in coalition terms, and the Americans take a slightly different approach to how they communicate what they do with their special forces. What I can tell you in coalition terms, special forces have been absolutely fundamental to the success of this mission. It absolutely goes without saying. They haven't been the be-all and end-all. There's a great deal of conventional troops in Syria, for example, United States conventional forces in Syria. But special forces, or special operations forces, as most nations would call them, have played a fundamental role. But that's a coalition observation, I would absolutely stress.
And I would just put, with that helpful level of abstraction on it, clearly the nexus between special operations forces and coalition air has been extensive and has been highly profitable.
Thank you, Madeline. Graham.
Thank you. Major General, you said earlier that the Abadi government led the coalition efforts in Iraq and also in Syria. The Raqqa City Council, amongst others, was involved with the coalition. I just want to ask about NGOs. How were military efforts coordinated with the non-government organisations as well as the government organisations?
Yeah, so it's an area where I spend a vast amount of my personal effort in both Iraq and Syria on this issue, but I think your question is primarily focused on Iraq in this instance. So how are they coordinated? Well, I think if we're honest, in some of the earlier battles it proved challenging. And I don't say that critically, it's kind of hard when you've got tens of thousands of people on the move. Ramadi, Fallujah, it was challenging. It was challenging for the government of Iraq, it was challenging for the United Nations. There was a great effort in the run-up to the Mosul battle to make sure that the very best plan was put in place. It was led personally by Prime Minister Abadi. He absolutely recognised the centrality of it to the operation. But I would, it's not fashionable, is it? But I would really praise the United Nations. They did an extraordinary job. The Deputy Special Representative to the Secretary General, Lise Grand, a Texan lady, is the unsung hero of the Mosul operation. She has huge experience, and many of the Iraqis involved in this didn't have this sort of experience of how you run a humanitarian operation on this scale. She did, and she was able to leverage all the agencies who had that experience. And she, through force of personality and professionalism, was able to advise and help the Iraqis with this. And it is, frankly, extraordinary that just shy of 1 million IDPs came out of Mosul, and yet there was never a humanitarian catastrophe. When we were doing the humanitarian planning back in sort of August time of 2016, August, September, those were our worst case scenarios, 1 million people. And we couldn't quite see our way through how we could manage that many people, and yet it happened. And she, Lise, who I work very, very closely with, put the humanitarian success down to 3 things. These are her observations, not mine. The first is the level of preparation by everybody in readiness for this deluge of people that just kept coming all the way through the 9 months. The second was the strength of civil-military cooperation, and that wasn't just between civil agencies and the Iraqi security forces, civil agencies and the coalition. And thirdly, she would say, is because Prime Minister Abadi and his generals placed the protection of civilians at the absolute centrepiece of the plan. So that is not to say it was perfect. It was pretty hairy at times, but it was pretty extraordinary. And the other thing I would, if I may, is just touch on, we tend to just focus on the battle and not what goes on afterwards. Again, the UNDP have done extraordinary work to help people in the aftermath of the battle. So I think the latest figure is something like 3.7 million people have returned to the homes. IDPs, internally displaced persons, have returned to the home in Iraq since the start of the campaign. There's about 2 million still to go. 3.7 million, humanitarians will tell you, is an unprecedented return rate. And that is due to great work by the government of Iraq, but also the UNDP bringing their skill set in terms of immediate stabilisation, making sure that things are there that will attract people back from a camp. That's about water, it's the basics of life, it's sanitation, it's schools. If you open schools, people will come back. If you look at the experience of Ramadi, people started coming back in very, very large numbers. Why? Because the schools were there, and that is a huge draw.
Comments on the Peshmerga, because obviously that's an issue within Iraq and how you dealt with the Peshmerga. They were obviously a government organisation, but some distance from Baghdad.
Yeah. So I think there's 2 levels to that. The first thing we would absolutely always defer to Prime Minister Abadi. Prime Minister Abadi would recognise the position of the governance structure in Erbil, but he would always expect you to defer to Baghdad in the first instance, and we were his partner, so we would absolutely take his lead. But with the full blessing of Prime Minister Abadi, we would work very closely with the regional government in Erbil to manage the humanitarian operation, to manage all of the other elements of the operation. I say in absolutely concert with Prime Minister Abadi. Indeed, Kurdish ministers would come down to the planning in Baghdad, and recognising the challenges of the referendum, Kurds and Iraqis would say they have never seen such good cooperation between Erbil and Baghdad as they saw during the Mosul battle. And then as it pertained to the military element of the Peshmerga, we trained the Peshmerga in exactly the same way as we trained the rest of the Iraqi security forces, and the British played an important role in that.
How did you factor in humanitarian considerations into military operations?
So I think it is, again, you're taking the lead from your Iraqi partner. Having got protection of civilians as a centrepiece of their plan, you've then got to help them with that. And so I've talked already about Lieutenant General Abdul Mir. He was the ground commander of the operation. He had an opposite number, Lieutenant General Basim, who was the humanitarian commander. So a 3-star general commanding the battle, and he had a humanitarian oppo who every meeting I went to, the two of them would be there together. That's gold standard. That's really, really impressive. So what do we then do? We then lock into that structure at every level, from a body down through his generals, all the way down. Now, of course, we're not humanitarians. We didn't have the mass to conduct a humanitarian operation. What I used to like to say to the UN and others is that we, the Combined Joint Task Force, need to be part of the conversation. We need to be part of the conscience. We need to be part of the advice. Because I touched earlier that General Abdul Mir, he would have loved to have seen Mosul empty. It would have been so much easier. He would have suffered far less casualties had there been no civilians. But there were civilians there. And as I said, he vexed over that enormously. And we would then help him as to how he would manage that to the best degree he could. I talked about the fact that civilians were starving inside Mosul, malnutrition, disease, and we were very lucky there weren't significant outbreaks. But again, we worked very closely with Abdul Mir and the United Nations to see how we could minimise the suffering to the local population.
Operations, there would be, and the flow of refugees, IDPs, into the camps, would be fighters, Daesh fighters, who were absconding, who turned up in the camps. You also, part of that humanitarian consideration, had the Yazidi population in some of those IDP camps, and Daesh amongst them. How did you manage to work with the humanitarian agencies where there's a military component or a military element that you've got to take consideration of?
Yes, again, that was designing from the outset, and I'm talking about Iraq, but there was a kind of parallel process in Syria. This was helping the Iraqis to understand that the first thing you had to do when a IDP hits the front line is you've got to get them back across the front line safely. You've then got to do some limited screening at that stage to satisfy yourself they haven't got weapons and they haven't got explosives and everything else. And that's really just a protection of life element. And then you move them further back from the front line, bus them back to secure areas where they begin to come into the humanitarian community, where further screening would go on to satisfy yourself that they didn't pose a threat to the security forces, to the humanitarians, and indeed to other civilians. There is risk in that process, of course there is, and I think it is reasonable to assume that some members of Daesh did skulk away through the IDP network. I think it would be naive to think otherwise. But a pretty robust screening mechanism in place, and again similar but different with the Syrian Democratic Forces as IDPs came out of Raqqa.
The battle they left behind mostly improvised explosive devices. I just wondered what the British and UK military personnel are doing now to help rebuild the city, but also to make it safe.
So I touched earlier on the fact that I think the British military are seen as global leaders when it comes to counter-improvised explosive device experience. I think it's to a significant degree born out of our Northern Ireland campaign and then into Iraq and Afghanistan. Is just an area that we are particularly competent at, and therefore we are playing a very significant role in training Iraqi forces with those skills as part of this campaign. As you say, these cities are left riddled, and it goes back to the brutality of Daesh. You go into a house, you pick up your pillow, and the pillow's a device. You open your fridge is a device. These are everywhere in both Iraq and Syria. So it is a massive challenge, and it just reminds us of the lack of humanity of our enemy. There are no quick ways to clear a city the size of Ramadi or Fallujah or Raqqa or Mosul. You've got to do it deliberately. And it comes down to a capacity issue, but the British government and other governments have put a lot of money into explosive remnants of war removal, and the very significant programs running by the UNDP and others in Iraq, and there's a similar program running in Syria. But we can't kid ourselves. This takes a lot of time. And if I may, one other slightly ghoulish element, but it's really, really important. Of course, under the rubble are bodies. Bodies pose a massive health hazard if you're trying to encourage people back into a city, get the sanitation going, get the water going. So you've got to clear rubble. So you put a huge amount of effort in both Syria and Iraq into resourcing rubble removal. Well, that in itself is a hugely dangerous activity because in amongst the rubble can be explosive. So this is a very challenging activity. My advice, I dealt, as I said, extensively with the Raqqa Civil Council, a very impressive group of people, Arabs and Kurds. And they would sort of slightly look to you at the enormity of the challenge they face and sort of look for guidance. And you've got to be honest with them and say, look, this is a generational challenge. You don't rebuild these cities quickly. And we can create the early yards, but this will take a considerable amount of time.
Quick intervention for Phil.
When we were in Baghdad, the beginning of 2016, before the attack on Mosul took place, one of the big issues that was continuously raised with us was the dam at Mosul, and what would happen if it did break. It would have been catastrophic for the whole of Iraq. I mean, how did you secure that? Was it an issue that you had to pay a lot of attention to?
We military we like to contingency plan. Nothing goes uncontingency planned. So there was significant threat to the dam. It's on public record. The government of Iraq doing very considerable work, not least with the Italians, an Italian company coming in to strengthen the dam. I'm going to drift into engineering territory I don't understand, but to make sure that it doesn't collapse. And there are times of the year when it is more prone or greater risk of collapse than at others. So that's a long-term plan. Prop it up so it doesn't collapse. But in the meantime, we clearly needed a contingency, as did the government of Iraq, should it collapse. And of course, we had done all the modelling in terms of what the water flows would be, and it's pretty catastrophic. So we had plans in terms of how we would support the government of Iraq with the continuing battle against Daesh during a post-dam collapse flood. And simplistically, General Townsend was going to lead that, and then I was going to we were going to break away, and I was going to run a kind of humanitarian assistance mission in support of the government of Iraq. So we were just mindful you could find yourself with mass floodings, and you'll probably have seen the modelling. It's pretty scary what could have happened.
Militarily, you were able to secure the dam.
Yes. Yep. So the dam is very, very heavily fortified by our Italian colleagues. It is an Italian company doing the work on the dam, and as part of the package, they agreed that they would protect the dam to make sure it wasn't vulnerable from attack.
Thank you very much indeed. Mark.
Thank you, Gentlemen. General, you've described the Battle of Mosul as the largest urban battle since the Second World War. So now that the dust has settled on that to some extent, what would you regard as the major lessons learned from that campaign?
So, I think there's two elements to that. I think the first one is the global coalition, governments decided with military advice that there might be a different way of doing things after the experiences of Iraq and Afghanistan, and that led us to this partner approach. So I think there's a huge amount of lessons that we need to pick apart in the cold light of day as to the relative merits of partner operations. I would conclude that there are, in the right circumstances, they are very, very appealing. But what I wouldn't want anyone to come away with is thinking that they're the panacea. They're the template answer in all circumstances. They quite patently aren't. And as I say, what we need to do is analyse the circumstance in which we think they are most pertinent, so that the next time we draw the right lessons. I think there are conclusions about, what you need for a partner-led operation. You clearly need a partner with the intent and capability to do the job. He's got to have broadly similar objectives to you. So there's a number of these kind of conclusions that you can draw. And what I am clear about is if the circumstances are right and a partner-style operation is relevant, that it is a very, or potentially very successful way of going to war for reasons I think you would recognise, because you've got indigenous forces liberating their own people. No nation likes to have foreign forces on their soil. But if it's indigenous forces liberating, you are giving the government huge legitimacy, the indigenous government huge legitimacy. You're giving their security forces huge legitimacy, and they probably need that because they probably are on the back foot, otherwise there wouldn't be something happening in the first place. And because of that, I think you're creating a much stronger platform from which to transition into some kind of more positive longer-term solution. And of course, we shouldn't kid ourselves that, from our perspective, it reduces our collective exposure as well, both in terms of, risk, political, military, casualty risk. So I think there's a package of lessons around what that tells us about partner operations that we need to analyse, and we absolutely are analysing. The second one, I think, is around urban warfare, where our American colleagues led a very extensive piece of work called the Mosul study. The British military were closely involved in that work as well, and it's actually been shared amongst ourselves. And that is an excellent document that analyses what Mosul tells us about the force for the future. There's a similar bit of analysis being conducted on the Raqqa battle. So what does it tell us? Well, with it, it's a tome, and it tells us lots of things. But I think one of the things it reminds us, and I touched on this, is just how challenging urban warfare is. And we need to recognise that potential adversaries may well pull us into cities, whether we like it or not. So we better be prepared for it. But there's a scale that comes with urban warfare. On D-Day of the Battle of Mosul, Prime Minister Bardi had 94,000 troops in assembly areas. It's just massive. So you learn strategic lessons all the way through to sub-tactical lessons about weaponeering, which is firmly into Jonny's sphere. And just absolutely reassure you, we are the British military, working very closely with our allies, are doing that work.
I'd offer, can I just something else, because we tend to lose it if we're not careful. I'd put the boot on the other foot and go and study your opponent too. Those drones were £700 each, allied to a radio / mobile phone and a 40-mile-an-hour up-armoured car. You've got a precision weapon that goes off with the force of a £2,000 weapon in the middle of an urban area, and you've done it incredibly cheaply if you're Daesh. You've got free-to-use computer applications that give you effectively targeting-level information. And you've got your C2 and your propaganda done for the price of a second-hand laptop and an internet connection. So somewhere in here, actually, is we've allowed technology to be now a very low bar of entry to allow some quite sophisticated responses. So being enemy-focused, as Rupert was touching on as well, is one of the things to be really, really focused on the back of this, as well as the environment in which we fought.
Are the conclusions of the Mosul study being fed into the Managing Defence Programme? Presumably they are.
Yes, I mean, without getting too far into the MDP process, it's a big process. It's taking a huge amount of feeds, and as the single services feed into that, we are absolutely taking account of the experiences of this campaign, but also, of course, a multitude of other campaigns as well.
Can we turn to Raqqa? You talked a lot about the challenges of military operations in Mosul. What were the challenges of military operations in Raqqa?
So if I start, and Jonny will give you the difference from the air perspective. Well, firstly, Raqqa is a very, very different city. It's much smaller, about 250,000 people, but that's still, it's still a big urban area. The layout of the city is very different. It's a significantly high-rise city. It's some very big, tall buildings. That poses very significant challenges to ground forces manoeuvring. So there's challenges there. The challenges and differences around the fact that you didn't have a sovereign government. We've touched on that. That was problematic. So our linkages into the Syrian Democratic Force Commander General Mazloum, the Raqqa Civil Council, and some people had some concerns about their authority. So there's some governance challenges, if you like. There are lines of communication challenges. You've got to get your stuff to the battle. And in Iraq, that was relatively easy because you're working in a secure or relatively secure environment. Going into Syria, deep into Syria, across the border from Iraq, where the border crossing would often be closed, very, very challenging. And of course, we had to get the equipment to our partners. Huge amount of materiel was needed, and we had to get that in. And there were some pretty extraordinary feats in terms of how we did that. And then it's the difference of partner. So I said 94,000 members of the Iraqi security forces. Well, Syrian Democratic Forces didn't have that, and they're not a military, they're not a sovereign state military with tanks and artillery and all the things that militaries have. They're a light militia force, relatively light numbers, relatively lightly trained, and therefore the manner in which we had to support them in the fight was different. The way that the way they fought on the battlefield was different, and we had to optimise the way we supported them to the way that they could operate on the battlefield.
And the only things I'd add, as Rupert said, it's much more of a vertical city in a way in terms of built up, but relatively, and only 5-6 floor high rise. But that's a hell of a defensive position, and a whole host of them as well. So we would quite routinely find re-infiltration happening that we'd then have to get a deal with, and as we touched on earlier, no environment exists by itself. So a complex land environment is a complex air environment within which to operate to make sense of what's going on down there. Equally, for coalition forces calling in strikes in support of the SDF, understanding the complexities above them was important as well. That said, Raqqa went in campaign length terms slightly quicker, but then we had done a fair amount of preparation for the operation before decisive ops. My last point I'd offer, in some areas they probably had a little bit longer to do their defensive preparations as well, so working through those was in some areas a little bit more of a challenge than Mosul, but then Mosul presented different challenges as well, canalising of forces, the use of IEDs, so they were both difficult fights in urban areas.
What was the extent of UK military involvement in Raqqa?
So, Jonny can talk to the air element. In terms of coalition support, you know, and the Secretary of State laid this before the House, you'd have to check in about February last year, that British members of the coalition were going into Syria, and that was to enable key members of the coalition, such as myself, to do my job. I clearly couldn't be a highly effective deputy if I couldn't even go into one of the countries involved in the operational area. So we played a very significant role, I and a number of British subordinates within the coalition, in terms of the kind of humanitarian and stabilisation work. So the military link with the Raqqa Civil Council was me, for example. So all of that work was led by British officers working very closely with the President's Special Envoy, Brett McGurk.
And for the air component, whilst we were doing work in support of the liberation of Mosul, we were also doing operations over Raqqa with the same array of equipment or platforms that we were fielding in both areas. And the art here at the coalition level, of course, was flexing what you had to seize in the ideal world, seize opportunity and reinforce success, or augment where required, because Daesh were fighting some level of tactical action in another part of the fight. I think what it does show is a flexibility that was required both obviously at the coalition level and in the component levels as well, to be able to prosecute two large fights at the same time and get the prioritisation right between them.
I'd like to spend what will probably be most of the remaining time, although there's one more question to come from Ruth, talking about the concept of partner operations. Now, in the case of these two countries, we have two very different situations. It's clear from your remarks in particular, General, that you have a great deal of admiration for the government in Iraq. And I think it's fairly clear from what's been said that in terms of the overall military effort, we have been mounting a much more weighty campaign in Iraq than in Syria. Would you agree with those two propositions to start off with?
Yes. I think I would. So you're right, I do have great respect for what the government of Iraq and their sovereign forces have achieved, and I think we should all. They've done extraordinary things over recent years. Was it more of an industrial, that may or may not have been the word used, industrial approach in Iraq vice Syria? Undoubtedly. Until relatively recently, and I'm talking, I guess, early part of 2017, the coalition footprint in Syria was very, very light. It was a kind of a bijou little operation, special operation forces enabling coalition strikes as they cleared places like Manbij. Once the operation for Raqqa, the preparation started, it was a 6-month approach march to Raqqa. To clearing the ground. As that started to build up, it was clear to us, the coalition, that you needed to bring industrial might. As I've said already, the Syrian Democratic Forces are not a heavy force, and they were clearly going to need quite a lot of coalition might to get them through these Daesh positions.
Now, is it true to say that, effective though airstrikes can be, for example, in degrading the finances and resources of an adversary like Daesh, in the end, if they're going to help you win a campaign, they have to be in support of forces on the ground who are going to reap the benefit of those airstrikes?
Well, I'm saying, we of course were doing all of those things, and they all paint to a story. If I can just give us, again, a little insight, and I'll come back to Raqqa. Tal Afar, northern Iraq, after Mosul was liberated, we all thought was probably going to could be 6-8 weeks hard fighting. It had all the potential to be so. It went in about 10 days or so, and one of the reasons it went was actually the morale within Daesh fighters had been just stripped away over the preceding months. Whether it was the fact that the coalition was after them and could find them and could ultimately take them out if required, whether it was the fact they weren't getting it paid, whether it was the fact they weren't getting the food through, whether it's the fact that they felt, oh, well, the game's up, isn't it? We've actually been rumbled and we're being defeated. So all of those things are important. So, without trying to sound like an air power zealot here, you have to do a number of things to contribute to the campaign, but absolutely to your point, in Raqqa, you then need your guys on the ground who you are supporting to step in, take the opportunities that you're providing, take and hold ground.
So we have a problem, don't we, when we're trying to do partnership operations in Syria compared with Iraq, because in Iraq, we know who we want to win. We know who we want to lose in both countries, it's Daesh. But in Iraq, we know we want the Iraqi government to be successful, and we have this close relationship with them. In Syria, our position was that we did not want the Syrian government to be successful, so we were very limited in our choice of partners, weren't we? And so far as I understand it, I think you said that the vast majority of airstrikes in Syria were in support of the SDF, and a much smaller number in support of a much smaller group in the south of the country.
Yeah, I mean, I think to suggest we were limited with our partners, I think does our partners a disservice. I think a pretty discerning process went through to identify who the coalition did and did not want to back. As you well know, there are a great many malign actors operating in Syria that the global coalition would not wish to work alongside. And certainly by the late stages, mid-2016, we had alighted on partners who we were confident had the intent, the capability, and the background to do the job at hand.
And those parts, sorry, I because we're under this time pressure, I have to try and intervene a little bit and move it on. So what I'm trying to get at is, can you tell me, other than the Syrian Democratic Forces in Syria, who you've referenced on many occasions in the course of the past couple of hours, and a small group you said in the south, that was pretty much it as far as Syria was concerned.
There were other moderate Syrian opposition groups further west of Raqqa that the coalition were working with at various times.
And did they conquer any territory?
Yes, absolutely.
Right.
And you may be familiar with the operation that Turkey conducted down towards Al-Bab. Turkey did that with opposition forces.
Yes. I mean, I don't ask you to stray beyond the military, but it's widely reported that the majority of opposition forces, other than the Kurds in Syria, are Islamist in orientation. Was that a factor that you had to take into account in deciding with whom to cooperate militarily?
I don't fully recognise that characterisation. You're absolutely right. One has to be very, very careful in picking your partners, because there are certainly Islamist groups out there who we would not wish to partner with, and we didn't. But within it wasn't only the Kurds. I would just re-emphasise, as you went into Arab territory, it was to a significant degree Arab fighters doing the liberating, and they were not Islamists.
And yes, those were Arab fighters who were part of the Syrian Democratic Forces umbrella, which was led by the Kurds. What observations do you have to make over the situation now, where those very forces who appear to have been our principal allies on the ground in Syria and now appear to be locked in conflict with Turkey?
So I mean, I think the message we would all wish to make as a coalition, both to our partner, the SDF, but also to Turkey, is that let's try and retain unity. Let's keep our focus on the defeat of Daesh. I think it's the position of the British government, but it's for others to comment, that they recognise that Turkey has some legitimate interests in their border areas. But as it relates to the fight against Daesh, we'd wish everyone to keep their eyes on the prize, and the prize is the defeat of Daesh. And I should just confirm the Syrian Democratic Forces are back firmly on the offensive in the Middle Euphrates River Valley as of the beginning of this month.
But as of this moment, the Turks and the Syrian Democratic Forces are absolutely in a full-scale confrontation, aren't they?
Look, I'm not going to get drawn into conversation about what's happening in Afrin. It is not part of the fight for which I was responsible. What I would comment on, and it plays to the complexity point Jonny talked about. So we know that the Turks have very considerable difficulty with the YPG as a group and their alleged connections to the PKK, and the PKK clearly are a terrorist group who pose significant threat to Turkey. The YPG have declared their independence from the PKK. They say they have no connections anymore. And we as a coalition were satisfied with that. We absolutely recognise that Turkey, as a member of the coalition, had a different perspective on that, and we continue to discuss that very closely with Turkey throughout in a very collaborative manner.
I'm going to come to Air Vice Marshal Stringer in a moment to talk about airstrikes per se, but can I just ask you this? Was it ever in your mind, looking strategically at Syria as opposed to looking strategically at Iraq, where it was quite clear to us that if we got rid of Daesh, you would have the Iraqi government in control? Was it ever in your mind that if Daesh were defeated in Syria, given the presence of Russia, that Assad would not be a substantial beneficiary of the defeat of Daesh in Syria?
So, I take you back to
who did you think was going to win in Syria overall?
That wasn't my job. Right. My job was to worry who was going to win in the defeat against Daesh.
Right.
And I was absolutely clear who was going to win, and win they almost have. So look, the counter-Daesh fight in Syria has to sit within something broader, and I'm not going to comment on the broader complexity. All I would observe is, if there were an easy answer to this, I think politicians around the world would have found the solution by now. So as a military guy, I've got quite a degree of sympathy with the political classes as they look at this challenge. Our job was to liberate those areas of Syria held by Daesh, and then allow that to connect into a broader political process.
At its height, what percentage of Syria would you say was under the control of Daesh at its maximum?
I'm trying to visualise a map, so forgive me, but I'm thinking 30% of land mass, something of that order, but I can't remember the exact percentage.
And now that's been reduced to a very small percentage?
A tiny fraction.
And in the reduction from 30% to a tiny fraction, how would you allocate the credit to the different forces that were battling Daesh? What percentage of that 30% is to the credit of the Syrian Democratic Forces for having retaken, what to the group in the south, what to other groups, and what to the Syrian government, just roughly?
I'm not going to give you a statistic, but the overwhelming successes came from the Syrian Democratic Forces. It is true to say that regime forces, backed by Russia and others, as they broke out of the Western Spine, have cleared some of the territory in the kind of desert west of the Euphrates. That is certainly true.
Thank you. Air Vice Marshal, have you got the list that we've distributed of the airstrikes? This is based on the statistics that's been given to us, and as you can see, from the beginning of the period when we started airstrikes in Syria, which is December 2015, we had a grand total of 333 airstrikes in Syria. Now that, of course, hides the fact there could have been quite a few aircraft on any one of those strikes. These are individual strike operations. I appreciate that. So we had 333 of those. And if you look at the graph, you can see that for the majority of the time between the beginning of those airstrikes in December 2015 right up until March 2018, the number of airstrikes in Syria per month on the majority of that period was in single figures and was often in low single figures. And indeed, if you look at the months from June to October 2017 inclusive, which is the period covered by the Battle of Raqqa, there were no fewer than 160 airstrikes in Syria. So isn't it quite clear, which is approximately half of the total, isn't it quite clear that the opportunities that we had to strike in Syria in support of forces on the ground were, for the most part, very limited until we got to the Battle of Raqqa?
Yeah, I would say that is fair. I'd put a couple of other points in which I think are important. First is when you put your aircraft into, and if you're going to be a good coalition partner, you put them in as effectively a campaign asset. So you put your aircraft where they can do make the optimum contribution to the campaign at that stage. So at the times you're looking at, there clearly was a significant amount of work that needed to be done in the campaign in Iraq, where UK assets were well configured to do that, and that's exactly what we did. You're absolutely right. As Mosul is drawing down and we've liberated the east, the west gets to smaller and smaller area by the river. It allows a proportionately greater focus on operations in Syria, and that's why you see the uptick there.
I know that General Jones has to go in 5 minutes exactly, so I'll keep this very brief, and I know Ruth wants to come in as well. Can I just check with you? The other big spike, as you can see from the graph, no fewer than 45 of the airstrikes in Syria were in the months of January and February 2018. Can you explain what that particular burst of activity was about?
Right, so that's actually outside my time as being the air component commander.
Okay,
so we can go back to you on it, but my suspicion, underlying suspicion, is that's probably as the operational focus moves to the Middle Euphrates River Valley. But we can check that for you.
So in sum, therefore, roughly 2/3 of the airstrikes in Syria were in support of pretty much set peace battles, and during the rest of the period we were having to do very limited numbers on very specific operations.
Well,
it's not a criticism.
I'm actually trying to give you the best possible answer, and Raqqa would have been the main focus. There were strikes around Tabqa as well. There were isolated strikes outside of there. But the nature of the particular fight and the way, we didn't mention it earlier, Raqqa was main effort in Syria. That was a campaign access for the SDF. So it's entirely appropriate that we'd have been supporting around there and against where Daesh were in numbers, and at that stage it was around Raqqa.
And just one last point. These airstrikes appear to have been very carefully documented. Is it true, therefore, that for each of these airstrikes there would be a record saying exactly where it was and exactly who it was in support of?
No, thank you for that. So for every single weapon dropped, every single weapon, not just strike, There is a targeting pack that is compiled, obviously pre-strike. Post-strike, we put the weapons video from targeting pods or whatever other sensors we have that we're looking at it. And then those records are archived for many years, so we can go back, if necessary, in the light of future evidence, or to pull lessons from them, or to inform future force development.
The reason I ask this is that we've asked the Ministry of Defence over and over again to say in support of which groups on the ground in Syria were particular airstrikes mounted, and they always say they don't keep the information. And the reason I ask that question is that we know that there were substantial forces that we could support in terms of the Syrian Democratic Forces, the Kurdish-led but wider than Kurdish group that we've heard so much about today. But I was just curious to know if either of you had seen in the course of your campaigning any sign of the 70,000 moderate forces of opposition that we were led to believe were also operating in Syria.
All right, Bob.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to comment on 70,000 or otherwise. What I'm going to tell you is that were there suitable partner forces with whom we could operate in Syria to complete the defeated Daesh? Answer to that, yes.
And judging by the analysis of the airstrikes, those forces were overwhelmingly the Syrian Democratic Forces.
Yeah, the hard yards against Daesh in Syria were conducted by the Syrian Democratic Forces.
That's great. Ruth, thank you.
Thank you. You've got a minute to answer this question.
I didn't think I was in quite that much of a hurry, but that's okay.
We're back in Iraq. Well, we went back to Iraq because arguably we hadn't finished the job before. And what do we need to do to make sure that this mission's actually fully completed? And are we at risk of leaving again too soon?
So, I touched earlier on the fact that everyone can have a judgment in terms of why Daesh rose, and I'm not going to pass comment on that. But what I do think is, if we're going to do this job properly from a military perspective, we don't just want to teach the Iraqi security forces how to retake their towns and cities. We want to give them a strong institutional backbone for the future, subject to ongoing political discussions. I think that is the intention. I know that a great many nations would wish to remain engaged on that basis at the invitation of the government of Iraq, but that must be at the invitation of the government of Iraq.
Straightforward for the government of Iraq. What about Syria?
So in Syria, it is a different context. So I touched, I think, earlier on the fact that at some point you transition, don't you? Yeah. And transitions can be long, they can be short. And there'll be a debate about how long the transition is in the Daesh-liberated parts of Syria. From a military perspective, my interest is only that there is a transition. Yeah. Otherwise, the hard yards that everyone has put in don't lead to anything. How that transition works is clearly for others to judge.
And it's exactly 1:30 as we promised. Thank you both very much indeed for your extremely detailed and interesting insights, and thank you for your service in these difficult theatres.
Thank you very much.
Concluded.
The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has